Hello, welcome. My name is Dr. Matthew Moynihan, and you're listening to the Fusion Podcast. You've made the right choice. This podcast is going to take you deep inside nuclear fusion research in a way that you've never heard before. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the Fusion Podcast. In this podcast, we are going to meet some of the innovators, scientists, and advocates pushing for commercially viable fusion power. We are going to explain many different fusion ideas to you in simple, plain English.
This is doing what the sun does, but in a room on Earth. If we can do that, we level up in civilization.
We're looking for this one super scientist that's going to come out of here with the right stuff, and in 5 or 10 or 15 years perhaps, put the plug in the last piece of this puzzle and solve the question of energy for mankind.
I had to do 8 separate conversations, each one several hours long, with various experts. Bill Evans turned out to be a really, really nice guy, and we talked for 2 hours with the investors listening in the background, and I convinced them that this machine had a shot.
The first thing you must know about fusion is that it represents the next great step in the long struggle by mankind to master energy in the natural world. This struggle dates back tens of thousands of years. Our first accomplishment was mastering fire. Next, we found a way to harness energy from animals. Eventually, we found a way to harness the energy in the wind and master the seas. We found ways to harness the energy contained in moving water and the chemical energy contained in oil and gas. And finally, unlocking the energy inside the atom. So if we're going to talk about fusion, it must not be lost on us that fusion represents the next great step in this long struggle to control the natural world. Fusion was first observed experimentally in 1935 by Dr. Mark Oliphant, but the first time it found any purpose was November 1st, 1952, at the Emawetok Atoll in the Pacific Ocean.
You have a grandstand seat here to one of the most momentous events in the history of science. In less than a minute, you will see the most powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes. And this is the significance of the moment. This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era. For the sake of all of us, and for the sake of our country, I know that you join me in wishing this expedition well.
It is now 30 seconds to 0 time. Put on goggles or turn away.
Minus 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, T0.
Uncontrolled nuclear fusion isn't very useful for anybody. What we needed was controlled nuclear fusion, made by a machine that would repeat the process every time we turned it on. That first happened very quietly at the Los Alamos National Labs in 1958. The machine that did it was named Scalia 1, which was a theta pinch machine. The machine worked by dumping current around a metal tube filled with deuterium gas, which is hydrogen with an extra neutron. It's one of two fusion fuels you'll hear about. The other one is tritium, which is hydrogen with two extra neutrons. The current going around the tube created a sharp inward force, which punched inward. This caused the gas to reach 15 million degrees Celsius, crushing the metal tube. In that moment, the atoms got close enough for the strong nuclear force to take over and pull them together. They fused into helium. In the process, some of their mass was lost and converted into energy through E equals mc squared. Mankind had silently slipped into the fusion age. The only problem was that it took way more energy to make that happen than energy it produced. In the 6 decades that have passed since that date, many fusion ideas have been tried and put forward. But one thing has always remained true. We cannot get more energy out than we put in. We have not been able to get net power, at least not yet. I got into fusion 10 years ago. My story actually started when I was a kid, growing up in Rochester, New York. My only goal back then was to be a great long-distance runner.
First step toward track immortality. Taking it out fairly casually right now as they swing around the back stretch. We haven't seen him going full speed in any of the qualifying rounds.
I was a distance runner in high school. I wasn't very good, but I worked really hard at it. When I graduated, I attended the University at Buffalo as an engineering major. The university had a Division I cross-country team, and I was determined to get on it. I tried out, but was quickly told I was not fast enough. Undeterred, I tried out again, and again, and again, and again, and again over the next 4 years. I made the team my senior year, and in my 5th year, I came in 92nd in the Northeast, running a 32:41 10K. It was a big personal success for me. I learned that I could work on problems that had little chance of success for long periods of time. I needed a new challenge, and I saw commercially viable fusion as my new goal. I wanted to help make that a reality. So in the fall of 2006, I enrolled at the University of Rochester to get my doctorate working on nuclear fusion research.
A few drops of deuterium in just 1 gallon of water contain the energy equivalent of 300 gallons of fuel oil.
This is from a 1985 documentary.
How can such an abundant resource be tapped?
The concept they are about to describe is known as inertial confinement fusion.
An extremely promising approach is called inertial confinement fusion.
We're starting with inertial confinement fusion because it's where I got my start. I spent 6.5 years studying this for my doctorate.
Inertial confinement fusion resembles the formation of a dense miniature sun.
Basically, you take a frozen ball of fusion fuel and you blast it.
The fuel in this pellet must be heated to 6 times the temperature of the sun, simultaneously compressed to 10 times the density of lead, and remain in this state long enough for most of it to burn. These conditions can be achieved by imploding the pellet with an intense pulse of laser light.
The pellet he's talking about is a frozen ball of fusion fuel. In ICF, we blast this with many laser beams.
The laser light appears to flow onto the pellet, uniformly heating the outer layer. The outer layer rockets away, forcing the remaining pellet wall inward, compressing and heating the fuel.
During the explosion, there's a compression wave inward that compresses the material down to a temperature and pressure where the atoms fuse together.
If we stop the implosion and look deep within the compressed core, we see deuterium and tritium nuclei encountering each other at high velocity. These two positively charged nuclei must collide with enough force to overcome their mutual electrostatic repulsion.
Nuclear fusion is the combination of two small atoms to make a bigger atom. In the process, some of the mass becomes energy.
In principle, the energy released during this fusion burn could be much greater than the energy initially required to implode the pellet. The fusion energy released by a succession of these individual pellet explosions could be efficiently converted to a continuous flow of electricity.
ICF is a pretty old concept. It was articulated by John Nichols in a 4-page Nature publication from 1972. Basically, you take a frozen ball of fusion fuel and you blast it. When that happens, the surface of the ice explodes outwards, and there's an equal and opposite compression wave inwards that crushes the material down to a temperature and pressure where the atoms literally fuse together. My doctorate was on this ice ball known as a target. I worked on a way to cheaply manufacture these targets. I also learned how tough real science can be, how often good ideas on paper never work out in reality. The whole experience gave me a deep respect for professional scientists. The key to making ICF work is a concept known as ignition. This is a fusion chain reaction. Inside the hot fusing plasma, the hydrogen fuses to make helium. Normally, helium coming off a fusion reaction is so hot it cannot be contained. It flies away. Ignition is different. The idea is to get the helium to stick around and drop its energy into the plasma. This should start more fusion reactions. So ignition is a fusion chain reaction. In the mid-1990s, the U.S. invested $3.5 billion into an ICF machine to get ignition. This was aptly named the National Ignition Facility.
Inside this football field-sized building about an hour outside San Francisco, the world's largest and most powerful laser, capable of simulating the energy force of a hydrogen bomb and the sun itself.
And I can see already my friends in Hollywood being very upset that their stuff that they show on a big screen is obsolete. We have the real stuff right here.
Dedicated at a ceremony Friday, the National Ignition Facility can focus nearly 200 lasers on a single target to create a huge release of energy. The laser's primary purpose is to help ensure the reliability of the nation's aging nuclear weapons. But officials say it could also one day be used to provide a clean, safe form of energy.
Fusion and fission, this can be used to create carbon-free energy that is in effect efficient and cost acceptable, is just a unique concept.
The laser took more than a decade to build and $3.5 billion. The facility is expected to ramp up power with a series of experiments over the next year.
When I was getting my PhD, the NIF was a very exciting machine. Everyone that I worked with was focused on making NIF a reality. It was opened in 2009, but unfortunately it failed to get ignition. In 2016, the Department of Energy admitted that it may never ignite. How could this have happened? The National Lab community had one main concept that the majority of the money, talent, time, and effort went into, and the flagship machine for that concept failed. After such a failure, it seems appropriate to have a frank discussion about why we are here and what steps we can take to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Before we get started, you must understand that in the past 6 decades, there have been many different ideas for how to build a fusion power plant that have been put forward. One of the goals of this podcast is to explain each one of these concepts to you in plain English. I want to bring these explanations to you directly from the people involved in this research. So far, I've done about 24 interviews. I've been trying to understand why, if fusion is so uncertain, why are we only funding a small number of concepts and ignoring any other ideas? I put this question to Dr. Robert Terry, who recently retired after 22 years of service at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C.
We don't know what the technology is to create a viable fusion reactor. You want to find collaborative groups that take the broadest possible scope. If I want to do fusion, like something like a polywell, I don't want to sit there and exclude things like the DPF or the stellar rate or the crashing compact torates. None of those things should be excluded. And that's where we went wrong back in the mid-'80s. They down-selected to 2 major concepts, and that was the dumbest thing I could imagine.
You see, the history of fusion research in the United States is filled with times of feasts and famines. The best years to be a fusion researcher in America were roughly from 1970 until the mid-1980s. Federal funding for fusion was very high during this period for 2 main reasons. First, we needed to stay ahead of the Russians and win the Cold War. And second, we had a 1970 oil crisis, which spurred our government to act. But most of this ended during the Reagan administration.
I was watching these people in the fusion program just weeping in the hallway. There was a lot of beer going down. Because DOA just came to the APS meeting mid-'80s, and they said, okay, we're down selecting to inertial confinement fusion and tokamak. And it was just that abrupt. And that was the dumbest thing possible. The thing we should have known is that you can't predict the course of research. A lot of universities have been fighting for funding so long, they're highly competitive. It's like 10 rats in a bag with food for 2 rats. And it's been that way for a long time. If you get an innovation in fusion concepts, then that innovation might be the seed crystal to help bring all this together. Or it might be snuffed out by the other 8 rats bag with you.
I was curious to know if there was a story that would illustrate what Dr. Robert Terry was talking about. And surprisingly, one came up in an early interview that I did with Dr. Alex Klein. Dr. Alex Klein has a very interesting story. In the early 2000s, he was getting his doctorate in plasma physics from Columbia University. He had an idea for a fusion reactor and went out and found a millionaire philanthropist that was willing to fully fund his idea. And I'll let him tell the rest of it.
And he basically offered to sponsor my studies at Columbia. To build this machine, he would pay for all the equipment, he would pay for my tuition. I went to my advisor and told him that, and it caused a big uproar. Columbia basically leaned on me very hard to not do this. The chairman told me that they get money from the U.S. government to work on tokamaks, and what are they going to say when they learn that there's other kinds of alternative confinement research? This guy told me, we can't stop you, but I guarantee you that you're going to be 45 years old by the time you get out of here. So they were going to make it very, very difficult to let me do this thing that I had found money for and funding for and everything.
In fairness to Columbia, Alex's idea ultimately did not work, but it took nearly 10 more years and $3 million of venture capital for Alex to figure that out. My story wasn't nearly that bad. When I was in graduate school, I came to the conclusion that ICF would not become a commercially viable technology. I wanted to explore other concepts, hopefully through publishing or postdocs, but was discouraged by my advisor, who said it was a major distraction to my doctorate. Undeterred, I started an anonymous blog, and since then have written about many different fusion concepts, with the goal of translating peer-reviewed published literature into plain English for the general public. All of that work has led me to this podcast. I'm hoping that you learned something that you didn't know. I'm hoping it sparks a frank discussion about what fusion is, how we support it, and what fusion means for the human race. In the next episode, we're going to meet someone who has been in fusion research for 50 years.
There really was an environmental catastrophe that was so bad that everybody recognized that you could blame it on global warming. Then the politicians would jump on their bandwagon. They'd be clamoring for all the energy they could get, and they'd throw money at it. Because I went through this in the 70s, and I saw it happen.
So stick around, because it's going to be a great episode. I want to thank Ravali Dalaburi, Jory Osterman, Dan Whalen, Rezwan Rezwani, Dr. Stephen Dean, Dr. Alex Klein, Dr. Robert Terry, Carl Greninger, my friends and family, and fusion supporters everywhere. Thank you.